The guns have finally stopped. For 6 long years, the world screamed. Metal tore through flesh, bombs whistled their terrible songs, and cities burned like torches in the night. Now, in the late spring of 1945, a strange and terrifying sound has taken over Europe and Asia. Silence. It is not a peaceful silence. It is the silence of a graveyard. It is the silence of exhaustion. Imagine standing in the center of Berlin, or Warsaw, or Tokyo. Around you, there are no landmarks left to guide you. The opera houses, the libraries, the ancient cathedrals, they are just jagged teeth of stone, sticking out of mountains of rubble. The air still smells of ash and wet concrete. The dust is so thick it coats your throat. This is what victory looks like. This is what defeat looks like. In the end, they look almost the. This series is not about the generals moving flags on a map. It is not about the politicians shaking hands in Yalta or Potsdam. Broken nations, broken hearts is about what happens when the adrenaline fades and the reality sets in. It is about the millions of people wandering through the wreckage, looking for a home that no longer exists. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history. We often throw around numbers 60 million dead, perhaps even 80 million, but the human mind cannot truly process a number that big. So, let's break it down. That is nearly 3% of the world's population wiped out. Entire family lines gone. Villages that had stood for 500 years erased in an. But the dead are the lucky ones. They are at rest. The survivors are the ones who must carry the weight. In 1945, Europe is a continent of ghosts. Millions of displaced persons are walking the roads. They are former slave laborers, concentration camp survivors, prisoners of war, and refugees fleeing the vengeful armies. They carry everything they own in a single suitcase or a tied-up bedsheet. They are hungry, they are sick, and they are terrified. There is no police force. There is no government. There is only the law of survival. If you want bread, you trade a wedding ring. If you want safety, you find a soldier. The moral compass of the world has been shattered. How do you go back to being a civilized society when you have seen your neighbors turned into monsters? In the East, the devastation is different, but just as total. The firebombing raids over Japan have turned wooden cities into charcoal. The atomic bombs have introduced a new kind of horror, a shadow burned into a wall, a sickness that kills you weeks after the explosion. In China, the scars run deep into the earth, fueled by years of brutal occupation. We are standing at year zero. The old world is dead. The empires of Britain and France are bankrupt and crumbling. Germany is cut into pieces. The United States and the Soviet Union are staring at each other across the ruins, already tightening their fists for the next fight. But before the Cold War freezes the world. By the autumn of 1945, the war of bullets had ended, but the war for bread had just begun. There is a specific kind of desperation that comes from an empty stomach. It is not a sharp pain. It is a dull, constant ache that slows your mind and makes your hands shake. In the ruined cities of Germany, Japan, and Poland, the average adult was living on less than 1,000 calories a day. That is half of what a human being needs just to exist. Money had become meaningless. A wheelbarrow full of German Reichsmarks or Japanese yen couldn't buy you a single potato. The printing presses had run all night during the war, making the paper currency worthless. If you walked into a shop in Berlin, the shelves were bare. The economy had collapsed completely. The old rules of commerce were dead. 5140. In this vacuum, a new, primal economy emerged. The black market. It happened in the shadows of the ruins, in the back alleys of Naples, and under the bridges of Tokyo. Here, bankers and professors traded their family heirlooms for butter. A grand piano might be traded for a sack of flour, a diamond ring for 3 cans of American Spam. But the true king of this new economy was not gold. It was the cigarette. Specifically, the American cigarette. Lucky Strikes and Camels became the new gold standard of Europe. You could hire a construction crew, pay for a doctor, or bribe a border guard, all with a carton of smokes. The cigarette was stable, it was portable, and in a stressful world, it was a luxury everyone craved. One cigarette could buy a day's worth of bread. This economic chaos created a bizarre world where the conquerors lived like kings among the ruins. American GIs, young men from Iowa or Texas, suddenly found themselves incredibly wealthy. With a few packs of cigarettes and some nylon stockings sent from home, they could buy anything. They could buy history. They could buy intimacy. This led to the uncomfortable reality of fraternization. Despite orders not to mix with the enemy, survival instincts took over. Local women, desperate to feed their children or their elderly parents, formed relationships with the occupying soldiers. It wasn't always about romance. Often, it was simply about survival. A soldier meant access to the commissary. It meant food. While the black market thrived in the shadows, another army was at work in the daylight. In Germany, they were called the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. With so many men dead or in prisoner of war camps, the task of clearing the millions of tons of debris fell to the women. They formed human chains, passing buckets of bricks from hand to hand. They stood atop dangerous mountains of concrete, hammering mortar off old bricks so they could be used again. They did this hard labor on starvation rations, wearing rags, fueled only by the sheer will to rebuild a roof over their heads before the snow came. Even the victors were not spared. In Great Britain, rationing became stricter after the war. If you look down at Europe from an airplane in the summer of 1945, the roads would not look like asphalt or dirt. They would look like moving rivers, dark, sluggish currents flowing in every direction. This was the greatest migration in human history. We call them displaced persons, or DPs for short, a sterile, bureaucratic name for a tragedy that is almost impossible to describe. Imagine 10 million people more than the entire population of New York City, today homeless, all at once. They are clogging every highway, every country lane, and every railway track that hasn't been blown up. But who are they? They are a mixture of victims and villains, often walking side by side. You have French and Dutch slave laborers, forced by the Nazis to build rockets, now walking west to get home. You have German families fleeing the vengeful Soviet army in the east, walking west to escape the rape and the gulags. You have prisoners of war, still in their tattered uniforms, looking for units that no longer exist. And then, you have the survivors of the camps, the Jews, the political prisoners, the Romani. They are skeletal figures in striped pajamas, wandering out of the gates of hell like Dachau and Belsen. But here is the cruel twist. Many of them have nowhere to go. For a Jewish survivor from Poland, home is a graveyard. Their village is gone. Their family is dead. If they return, they might be killed by neighbors who stole their houses. So they sit in camps again, allied camps this time, behind barbed wire, waiting for a world that doesn't want them. They are liberated, yes, but they are not free. The chaos on the roads is absolute. There is no gas for cars. People are pulling wooden carts piled high with grandfather clocks, mattresses, and pots and pans. Old women are pushing wheelbarrows with their grandchildren sleeping onto. The smell of these roads is distinct. It is the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting horse carcasses pushed to the ditch, and fear. At night, the forests come alive with danger. Banditry is rampant. Former soldiers who kept their weapons are now highwaymen, robbing refugees for a pair of boots or a loaf of bread. The Allies, the Americans, British, and Russians are completely overwhelmed. How do you feed 10 million people when the bridges are down and the trains aren't running? The American GI, who just wanted to go home after fighting a war, now finds himself acting as a police officer, a judge, a doctor, and a babysitter. They set up checkpoints, but it's like trying to stop the tide with a spoon. At the border crossings, the lines stretch for days. People faint in the heat. Babies are born in ditches. Old men die on the roadside and are left there because the column must keep moving. There is a desperate obsession with papers. Everyone needs a stamp, a pass, an ID card. In a world without law, a piece of paper with an official stamp is more valuable than gold. It proves you exist. It proves you are entitled to a ration of soup. while the people starved and the cities crumbled. A different kind of cleanup was happening in the halls of power. The Allies had made a promise. The architects of this nightmare would pay. But how do you punish a crime that is so massive it defies all laws? How do you put a whole system on trial? The hunt for war criminals began immediately. Teams of investigators scoured the countryside, kicking down doors in farmhouses and searching through false walls in alpine chalets. They were looking for the men who had run the camps, the generals who had ordered the massacres, and the doctors who had performed the experiments. Many had tried to vanish. Heinrich Himmler shaved his mustache and put on an eye patch. Others, like the notorious Dr. Mengele, slipped through the net entirely, fleeing down the rat lines to South America. But many were caught. They were dragged out of hiding, stripped of their uniforms, and thrown into the same cells where they had once tortured others. This led to the Nuremberg Trials. It was a spectacle the world had never seen before. In the Palace of Justice, one of the few buildings in Nuremberg, still standing, the leaders of the Third Reich sat in the dock. Goering, Hess, Ribbentrop, men who had once made the world tremble now looked small, pale, and pathetic. They wore headphones, listening to translators describe their atrocities. But justice was messy. The Allies launched a program called denazification. The idea was to scrub the Nazi ideology out of the German brain. Every adult had to fill out a questionnaire, the Fragebogen, detailing their past. Were you a party member? Did you inform on your neighbor? The problem was the scale. If you fired every teacher, judge, and mailman who had been a Nazi party member, the country would stop functioning. You couldn't run a train system if all the engineers were in prison. So, compromises were made. The little Nazis were fined or ignored, while the big Nazis were hanged. It left a bitter taste. Survivors saw their former tormentors walking free, working as local clerks or policemen again, simply because they were useful in Japan. The situation was even more complex. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East began in Tokyo. General Tojo and others faced the news. But there was one man who was untouchable. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme ruler of occupied Japan, made a calculated decision. To control Japan, he needed the emperor. So, Hirohito, the man in whose name millions had died, remained on his throne. He was stripped of his divinity, forced to admit he was a human being, but he was safe. For many American veterans and Asian victims, this was the ultimate betrayal. The psychological weight of these trials was immense. For the first time, the general public saw the film footage from the camps. They saw the piles of shoes, the ovens, the mass graves. The defense of "I was just following orders" was dismantled, piece by piece. Victory did not bring mercy. For millions of people across Europe and Asia, the end of the fighting was simply the signal for the start of the reckoning. The pressure cooker had exploded. After years of brutal occupation, humiliation, and terror, the populations of liberated countries were not just happy, they were furious. They wanted blood before the courts could be set up. There was the wild purge in France, Italy, and the Netherlands. The streets became theaters of revenge. Armed bands of resistance fighters, young men with armbands and stolen rifles, roamed the towns looking for collaborators. But who was a collaborator? Sometimes it was a mayor who helped the Nazis. Sometimes it was just a shopkeeper who sold them wine. Sometimes it was just a neighbor you didn't like. The most visible victims of this rage were the women. In France alone, roughly 20,000 women were accused of horizontal collaboration, sleeping with German soldiers. The punishment was medieval. Crowds would drag these women into the town squares. Men would hold them down while others used sheep shears to shave their heads. Bald. They stripped them to their underwear, painted swastikas on their chests with tar, and marched them through the streets to be jeered at, spat on, and beaten. It was a release of national shame projected onto the bodies of these women. It was ugly, it was chaotic, and it was happening everywhere. But if the West was ugly, the East was apocalyptic. The tide had turned completely. For years, Nazi Germany had tried to enslave Eastern Europe. Now, the Germans were the ones on the run. This was the Vertreibung, the expulsion. Millions of ethnic Germans who had lived in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary for centuries were given minutes to leave. They were forced out of their homes by angry mobs and Soviet soldiers. They were marched west, back towards a ruined Germany that couldn't feed them. It wasn't an orderly evacuation, it was a death march. Civilians were beaten, robbed, and executed on the roadside. The hatred was so deep that even German children were seen as enemies. In Asia, the situation was equally volatile. In China and Korea, the collapse of the Japanese Empire left thousands of Japanese civilians stranded. The resentment for the brutal Japanese occupation boiled over. There were no trials here, only mobs. The world was operating on the Old Testament law, an eye for an eye. There was no innocent until proven guilty. If someone pointed a finger at you and called you a traitor, you could be dead within the hour. The police forces had disintegrated. The Allied armies were trying to keep order, but they couldn't be everywhere. They often stood by and watched, unsure if they should intervene in domestic quarrels of the people they just liberated. This lawlessness terrified the Allied leaders. They realized that if they didn't establish a system of justice soon, the killing would never stop. They had to replace the mob with the gavel. By November 1945, the wild revenge of the streets began to be replaced by the cold, hard wood of a courtroom. The Allies faced a dilemma that had never existed before. What do you do with a government that committed crimes so massive? They aren't even in the law books. Executing the Nazi leaders without a trial would have been easy. Stalin even suggested it. He proposed taking 50,000 German officers and shooting them immediately. But the Americans and British insisted on something else. They wanted to prove that civilization was still alive. They wanted to defeat the Nazis not just on the battlefield, but in the courtroom. And so, they chose Nuremberg. It was a symbolic choice. Nuremberg was the spiritual home of the Nazi Party, the place where Hitler had held his massive rallies. Now, it would be the place where his empire was buried. The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg was one of the few buildings still standing. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy. 21 of the most powerful men in the Third Reich sat in the dock. Hermann Göring, the flamboyant head of the Luftwaffe, sat in his gray uniform, stripped of his medals, but still arrogant. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, looked vacant and strange, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in history, crimes against humanity became a legal charge. Prosecutors presented evidence that shocked the world. They didn't just use witnesses. They used the Nazis' own records. They brought in the shrunken heads from Buchenwald. They showed films of the bulldozers pushing bodies into mass graves. 01, 40, 225. The defendants were headphones, listening to the translations. Some looked bored. Some looked ashamed. Göring laughed and took notes, treating it like a game of chess he could still win. He argued that they were just following orders, that the victors were judging the losers. But the evidence was a mountain of skulls that no argument could climb over. The world watched, mesmerized. This wasn't just a trial, it was a history lesson. It forced the German people, who claimed they didn't know, to look at the footage. It forced the world to define what evil actually was. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, a similar process was beginning. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East was setting up to judge the Japanese leadership. But there was a massive, controversial shadow over Tokyo. The Emperor, Hirohito, was not on trial. General Douglas MacArthur had decided that to rebuild Japan, he needed the emperor to stay on the throne as a figurehead. So, while General Tojo and others took the fall, the man in whose name they fought remained untouchable. It was a political decision, a compromise made for stability, but it left a bitter taste for many victims across. These trials were imperfect. They were victor's justice in many ways. The Allies, after all, were not tried for their own controversial bombings of Dresden or the atomic bombs. But despite the flaws, while the judges in Nuremberg were looking at the past, the generals in Berlin were looking at the future with terror. The alliance that had won the war, the strange friendship between the capitalist West and the communist East, was rotting. It had never been a marriage of love. It was a marriage of convenience to kill Hitler. Now that Hitler was dead, the divorce was getting messy. Germany was the prize. It was now cut into 4 zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin, the capital, was deep inside the Soviet zone, but was also split into 4 sectors. It was a tiny island of capitalism in a sea of communism. The tension at the checkpoints was electric. Soldiers who had hugged each other in May 1945 were now staring down the barrels of their rifles at one another. In 1946, Winston Churchill, now out of power but still the loudest voice in the room, traveled to Missouri. He stood up and spoke the words that would define the next 40 years. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. He was right. Behind that curtain, Stalin was tightening his grip. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, they were not being liberated. They were being absorbed. Stalin was paranoid. He wanted a buffer zone. He wanted to make sure that no army could ever march into Russia again. So he built a wall of satellite states, ruled by puppet governments that answered only to Moscow. The West panicked. Europe was starving, weak, and broke. It was the perfect breeding ground for communism. In France and Italy, communist parties were winning huge support. The Americans realized that if they didn't do something, all of Europe might turn red just out of hunger. Enter George Marshall. In 1947, he proposed the most ambitious economic rescue plan in history. The Marshall Plan. The idea was simple: pump billions of dollars into Europe, rebuild the factories, pave the roads, feed the people. Why? Because rich people don't become communists. It was bribery on a continental scale, but ships loaded with American wheat, machinery, and mules started arriving in European ports. The Marshall Plan logo, 2 shaking hands, was stamped on everything. It brought hope back to Western Europe. But Stalin forbade his satellite states from taking the money. He called it an imperialist trap. This was the moment the world truly split in 2. The West got the money and the democracy. The East got the secret police and the 5-year plans. The border wasn't just a line on a map anymore. It was a prison wall. And in the middle of this sat Berlin. The ruins were still there, but now they were political chips in a global poker game. The Soviet Union tried to starve West Berlin into submission by blocking the roads. The West responded not with tanks, but with airplanes, the Berlin airlift. For a year, the sky roared with engines, dropping candy to children and coal to power plants. While politicians were building walls, the soldiers were trying to go home. Millions of men were demobilizing. They handed in their rifles, took off their uniforms, and put on suits that didn't fit quite right anymore. They were told to go back to normal. But what is normal after you have stormed the beaches of Normandy or fought hand to hand in the jungles of Guadalcanal? There was no name for PTSD back then. They called it battle fatigue or shell shock. And it was something you didn't talk about. You were expected to be the strong, silent type. You got a job, you got married, and you forgot. But at night, the nightmares came. Men screamed in their sleep. They drank too much. They stared at walls for hours. This was the hidden scar of the war. A generation of fathers who were physically present, but emotionally absent. They had seen things that civilized society couldn't understand, so they walled it off inside themselves. And what about the women they came home to? The women had changed too. For years, Rosie the Riveter had run the factories. They had built the planes, managed the finances, and tasted independence. Now, the government propaganda machine went into overdrive, telling them to go back to the kitchen. Give your job to a returning hero, the posters said. It was a bitter pill to swallow for many, forced back into domestic life after proving they could do anything a man could do. Despite the trauma, there was a desperate biological urge to embrace life. Death had been the master for so long. Now, life wanted its turn. This was the start of the baby boom. It happened almost instantly. Weddings were happening in record numbers, sometimes weeks after a soldier returned. Housing developments like Levittown in New York sprang up overnight, rows of identical little houses for identical little families. It was the birth of suburbia. It was a reaction to the chaos. People wanted safety. They wanted predictability. A lawn, a fence, a car, television. This new world was shiny and optimistic on the surface. But underneath, the anxiety remained. The atomic bomb had changed the psychology of the human race. For the first time, we had the power to end the world. Schoolchildren were doing duck and cover drills, hiding under their wooden desks, as if that would save them from a nuclear fireball. The fear wasn't hypothetical, it was real. The mushroom cloud was the background wallpaper of the 1950s. So, society created a distraction. Consumerism. Buy a new fridge. Buy a bigger car. Buy the latest detergent. If we fill our lives with things, maybe we won't think about the shadow hanging over us. The wreckage of 1945 was being paved over with asphalt and shopping malls. The world was moving on, faster and faster, desperate to leave the smell of ash behind. War is a butcher, but it is also a scientist. The 6 years of slaughter had accelerated human technology by 50 years. As the dust settled, we looked around and realized the tools we had built to kill each other were now the keys to the future. The most obvious change was in the sky. The propeller age was dead. The jet age had arrived. The German Me-262 and the British Meteor had proven that speed was the new king. Suddenly, the world shrank. Distances that used to take days now took hours. The Atlantic Ocean, once a formidable barrier, became a pond you could hop across. But even faster than the jets were the rockets. In the dying days of the war, Nazi scientists like Wernher von Braun were captured not to be put on trial, but to be hired. Operation Paperclip. The Americans and the Russians grabbed as many German scientists as they could. Why? Because of the V-2 rocket. The weapon that had terrorized London was now the blueprint for the space race. The Saturn V rocket that would eventually take men to the moon was a direct descendant of a Nazi weapon built by slave labor. It is a dark irony of history. The path to the stars was paved with the suffering of the concentration camps. Down on the ground, another revolution was happening. Listen. Penicillin, which had been mass-produced for the first time to save soldiers from gangrene, was now available to the public. Before the war, a scratch from a rose thorn could kill you. Now, infections were a nuisance, not a death sentence. Blood transfusions, plastic surgery, and trauma care had all advanced decades in just a few years. The war had provided a gruesome, endless supply of patients for doctors to practice on. We learned how to fix the human body by breaking it 1,000,000 times over. And then there was the invisible giant, the computer. To crack the Nazi Enigma code, British genius Alan Turing and his team had built Colossus. To calculate artillery tables, the Americans built ENIAC. These were room-sized monsters filled with vacuum tubes and switches. They were designed to calculate bomb trajectories and decode secrets. But they were the ancestors of the device you are watching this video on right now. The digital age was born in the fires of World War II. Information was the new ammunition. Even our food changed. Technologies developed to feed soldiers on the front lines. Canning, dehydration, preservatives flooded the civilian market. Instant coffee, spam, frozen dinners. It wasn't gourmet, but it was efficient. The war had industrialized everything, even our lunch. We were moving into a synthetic, high-speed, plastic-wrapped future. When you see cities burn and millions die for no reason, you stop believing in the old fairy tales. The war killed more than people. It killed the idea that humanity was inherently good. The old religion, the old morality, the old art, it all felt fake. How could you paint a pretty landscape after Auschwitz? How could you write a polite poem after Hiroshima? In the smoke-filled cafes of Paris, a new philosophy took hold. Existentialism. Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus became the rock stars of the intellect. Their message was stark. The universe is empty. There is no grand plan. God is silent. You are alone. It sounds depressing, but for the young generation, it was liberating. If there is no pre-written script, then you are free to write your own. You define your own meaning. This was the year zero of the mind. Art exploded into chaos. The painters didn't want to paint reality anymore. Reality was a nightmare. So they painted their feelings. Abstract expressionism was born. Jackson Pollock throwing paint at a canvas wasn't just making a mess. He was screaming. He was unleashing the chaotic energy of the atomic age. The art was jagged, confused, violent. It looked like the world felt. And then, there was the cinema. In Italy, they didn't have money for sets or costumes. So they took the cameras into the streets. They filmed real people in the real ruins. Neorealism. Films like Bicycle Thieves showed the raw, unpolished truth of poverty. No happy endings. Just the struggle to survive. In America, the movies got darker too. Film noir emerged. Shadowy detectives, femme fatales, corrupt cops. It was a reflection of the cynicism that the soldiers brought back home. The hero wasn't a knight in shining armor anymore. He was a flawed, broken man trying to do one good thing in a bad world. But the biggest shift was the youth. Before the war, you were a child, and then you were an adult. There was no in between. But in the late 40s and early 50s, a new tribe appeared. The teenager. They had money in their pockets from the economic boom. They had cars. And they had a new sound. It started in the black clubs of the South. A driving, thumping rhythm. Rhythm and blues. It was dangerous. It was sexual. It was loud. It was the heartbeat of a generation that wanted to dance on the grave of the old world. The adults were terrified. They saw this new culture as moral decay, but they couldn't stop it. The genie was out of the bottle. The war had shaken the foundations of authority. If the wise old men had led the world into a slaughterhouse, why should the young listen to them ever again? The rebellion had begun. We have walked through the ruins of 1945. We have seen the starvation, the revenge, the trials, and the rebuilding. Now, decades later, we must ask, did the world ever truly heal? Walk through Berlin today. It is a vibrant, modern city. But look down. Embedded in the cobblestones are brass plates, Stolperstein. Each one names a Jewish person who lived there and was murdered. The scars are still right beneath our feet. Go to Hiroshima. The Peace Park is green and beautiful, but the shadow of the bomb dome still stands. A skeleton warning us of what we are capable of. The war didn't just end. It evolved. It lives in our borders, our alliances, our technology, and our nightmares. The United Nations, the European Union, the State of Israel, the dominance of the US dollar, all of these are children of 1945. We built these structures to say, never again, and yet, we see the same ghosts rising. Today, rationalism, hatred, the hunger for territory, the silence of the bystander, the generation that fought and survived. This hell is almost gone. They are leaving us. When the last veteran dies, when the last concentration camp survivor passes away, who will tell their story? It falls to us. We are the guardians of their memory. Broken nations, broken hearts, is not just a history lesson. It is a warning. It shows us how quickly civilization can collapse when we let fear and hatred take the wheel. But it also shows us something else. It shows us the incredible power of the human spirit to rebuild. We saw enemies become allies. We saw cities rise from ash. We saw people who had lost everything find the courage to love again, to have children, to plant gardens in the craters of. The world of 1945 was a broken world, but it was in those cracks that the light got in. The music, the art, the rights, and the freedoms we enjoy today grew out of that soil. We are standing on the shoulders of giants who carried the weight of the world when it was burning. So, the next time you see an old photograph of a ruined city, don't just see the destruction, see the silence, see the struggle, and remember that peace is not a guarantee. It is a fragile thing that must be built, brick by brick, every single day. Thank you for watching Broken Nations, Broken Hearts. If this story moved you, share it. Let the memory live on.